Something just happened in Tehran that the world cannot afford to ignore, and if you have been following the tension between Iran, the United States, and Israel over the last few weeks, what you're about to hear is going to change the way you see the next 30 days. Because Iran did not just make another statement. Iran did not just repeat the same tired rhetoric we have heard 100 times before. This time, the language was different. The tone was different. And people inside the region who study these regimes for a living are saying, this is the clearest, most direct warning Tehran has issued since the guns went quiet after the last round of fighting. So stay with me, because by the end of this video, you're going to understand exactly why this warning matters, what triggered it, who is really pulling the strings behind the scenes, and why the next few weeks could decide whether this entire region slides back into open war or somehow, against all odds, finds a way to pull back from the edge. Let's start with what actually happened, because the headlines alone do not tell you the full story. Iran's foreign ministry, through a series of diplomatic channels and a lengthy public statement, declared that any new military action taken against it by the United States or by Israel would trigger what officials called a decisive and proportionate response from its armed forces. Now on the surface, that might sound like something you have heard before. Iran has threatened retaliation many times in the past. But here is what makes this moment different. This warning did not come out of nowhere. It came after weeks of an extremely fragile, almost paper-thin, ceasefire that has been holding the region together by a thread. And it came at a moment when both sides, Iran and the United States, are quietly preparing for the possibility that this truce collapses completely. Think about that for a second. We are not talking about a random threat thrown out for political theater. We are talking about a government that fought a brutal 12-day war just months ago, a war that left senior military commanders dead, critical infrastructure damaged, and a population inside Iran deeply shaken. And now, that same government is telling the world, in no uncertain terms, that it is prepared to do it all again if pushed. That is not posturing. That is a warning shot, fired in plain daylight. So why now? Why is this warning landing at this exact moment? To understand that, you need to rewind just a little bit and look at what has been happening on the ground. After the last major round of strikes between Israel, the United States, and Iran, a fragile memorandum of understanding was put in place. It was never a formal peace deal. It was closer to a pause, an agreement that allowed both sides to step back from the brink without either one claiming total victory or admitting total defeat. But here is the problem with pauses like this. They rarely hold for long, especially when neither side actually trusts the other. And that is exactly what we are seeing play out right now. Reports coming out of the region suggest that Iran has been using this window, this so-called ceasefire period, to quietly rebuild. Iranian military spokespeople have openly admitted, on the record, that they used the pause to import new equipment, repair damaged systems, and reconstruct capabilities that were hit hard during the fighting. Let that sink in. While diplomats were shaking hands and talking about de-escalation, Iran's military apparatus was rearming behind the scenes. That is not speculation. That is coming directly from Iranian military officials themselves. On the other side of this equation, the United States has not been sitting still either. There have been direct statements from Washington making it clear that stronger action is on the table if Iran does not fully commit to the terms being discussed, particularly around the Strait of Hormuz and around Iran's nuclear ambitions. And this is where things get really interesting. Because the Strait of Hormuz is not just some obscure waterway that only shipping experts care about. This is one of the most important choke points on the entire planet. A massive percentage of the world's oil and gas passes through that narrow stretch of water every single day. If Iran were to close it, even temporarily, even partially, the economic shockwaves would be felt from Los Angeles to London to Lahore. Gas prices would spike. Global markets would shake. And that is exactly why control over that strait has become one of the single biggest points of leverage Iran holds in these negotiations. Now here is where it gets even more layered. Because inside Iran itself, this is not a unified government speaking with one voice. There is a real and growing divide happening behind closed doors in Tehran. And it is shaping everything we are seeing play out publicly. On one side, you have what people call the pragmatist camp, officials who understand that Iran's economy is hurting, that another full-scale war would be devastating, and that some kind of negotiated settlement is the only realistic path forward. Iran's president has reportedly pushed for exactly this kind of diplomatic approach, and there are signs that at least some of the country's top security officials are backing that direction. But on the other side, you have the hardliners, particularly factions tied to the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, who see any compromise over the Strait of Hormuz or over Iran's broader military posture as an unacceptable surrender. These are the people who believe that showing any weakness right now, after everything Iran has already endured, would be catastrophic for the regime's credibility both at home and across the region. And right now, it appears that this harder line faction is the one actually dominating decision-making inside the country. That tension, that internal tug of war between negotiators trying to find a diplomatic off-ramp and hardliners who want to hold the line no matter the cost, is a huge part of why Iran's public messaging keeps swinging between statements about wanting peace and statements warning of decisive retaliation. And there is even more going on beneath the surface than just this internal power struggle. There have been reports, and this is a detail that deserves real attention, of tension at the very top of Iran's leadership structure. Sources close to the regime have suggested that questions are being raised about how much control certain officials, including figures close to the supreme leader's inner circle, are exerting over the country's foreign policy decisions. When you have that kind of uncertainty at the highest levels of a government that controls a massive military and a stockpile of missiles capable of reaching deep into enemy territory, that uncertainty itself becomes dangerous. Because in moments like this, it is not always the calm, calculated voices that win out. Sometimes it is the loudest, most aggressive faction that ends up shaping the final decision. Now let's talk about something that has been happening quietly in the background, something that most casual news consumers are completely missing, and that is the situation in Yemen and along the broader shipping lanes near the Bab al-Mandeb Strait. Just recently, an Indian-flagged commercial vessel was struck near Yemeni waters, reportedly hit by some kind of drone or waterborne explosive device close to Houthi-controlled territory. And here is the part that should really catch your attention. There are credible reports suggesting Iran's Revolutionary Guard has been helping the Houthis reinforce their launch positions overlooking key shipping corridors. This is not an isolated incident. This is part of a much larger pattern where Iran uses allied militias and proxy forces scattered across Yemen, Iraq, and elsewhere to project power and apply pressure without having to directly engage its own military. It is a strategy Iran has used for years, and it lets Tehran maintain a level of deniability while still making its presence felt across the entire region. And speaking of proxy forces, there's another storyline unfolding right now inside Iraq that connects directly back to this warning from Tehran. Iraqi officials have reportedly begun taking serious steps to prevent Iranian-backed militias operating inside Iraq from launching attacks on neighboring countries. Why does this matter? Because Saudi Arabia, Jordan, and Kuwait have apparently warned Iraq's government directly that if these militias strike their territory, they will respond with their own military action inside Iraqi soil. Think about how explosive that is. You now have a scenario where a conflict that started as a standoff between Iran, Israel, and the United States could potentially pull in Iraq, Saudi Arabia, Jordan, and Kuwait, turning a regional crisis into something far larger and far harder to contain. This is exactly why Iran's latest warning is not just about Iran and the United States trading threats back and forth. It is about an entire web of alliances, proxies, and rivalries that could all be activated at once if the situation deteriorates further. So let's zoom back out and ask the question everyone watching this video actually wants answered. Is this warning just more noise? More of the same rhetoric we have heard a dozen times before? Or is this genuinely different? Here's my honest take after digging through everything coming out of the region. This warning is different, and it is different for a few very specific reasons. First, the timing. The statement did not come during a moment of calm. It came right as reports were circulating about the possibility of new American and Israeli strikes targeting Iran's energy infrastructure, the kind of facilities that keep the country's economy functioning. When a government issues its strongest warning in direct response to reports of imminent strikes on its energy sector, that is not random timing. That is a calculated signal meant to deter action before it happens. Second, the language itself. Iranian officials have specifically referenced their willingness to respond in a way that exceeds what happened during previous rounds of retaliation, explicitly comparing potential future action to past operations that were widely seen as significant military responses. When a government starts comparing its next move to its most aggressive past operation and says the next one would be even more severe, that is a very deliberate escalation in tone, not an accident of translation or diplomatic phrasing. Third, and this is the piece that I think gets overlooked the most, the warning is coming at a time when Iran has, by its own admission, used the ceasefire period to rebuild and reconstitute military capacity. That means this is not an empty threat from a weakened, depleted military. This is a warning coming from a government that believes, rightly or wrongly, that it now has more capability sitting behind that warning than it did just a few months ago. Now, does that mean war is guaranteed? Absolutely not. And I want to be really clear about that, because there is a version of this story that plays out completely differently. Remember that internal divide we talked about earlier? The pragmatists versus the hardliners inside Iran's government? There are real, active negotiations happening right now around reopening the Strait of Hormuz and around addressing Iran's nuclear program in exchange for economic relief and a genuine off-ramp from further conflict. Reports have even suggested that a planned round of American strikes was called off after Iran, and regional mediators indicated they had reached the outline of a deal, one that would include a complete reopening of the strait and steps toward eliminating what the United States considers Iran's nuclear threat. So there genuinely is a diplomatic path still open. The question is whether the hardline factions inside Iran will allow that path to actually be walked, or whether they will keep pushing provocations, whether through proxy attacks in Yemen, tension in Iraq, or aggressive rhetoric out of Tehran, that eventually forces the more pragmatic voices out of the room entirely. And this is where I want you to really think about what is at stake here, because this is not just a story about Iran, America, and Israel. If the Strait of Hormuz situation escalates, if shipping through that corridor becomes unsafe or gets disrupted even briefly, the ripple effects hit every single person watching this video, no matter where you live. Oil prices do not stay contained to one region. When roughly a fifth of the world's oil supply runs through a single narrow waterway, any disruption there sends prices climbing everywhere, from the gas station down your street to the cost of shipping goods halfway around the world. This is why global powers, who are not even directly involved in this conflict, countries like China, which relies heavily on energy imports through that same corridor, are watching this situation incredibly closely and reportedly pushing back against any prolonged disruption. There's also something deeply human buried underneath all of this geopolitical maneuvering that I think gets lost when we talk about missiles, strikes, and military capabilities. Ordinary people inside Iran have already lived through the trauma of the last major conflict. Families lost loved ones, cities dealt with damaged infrastructure, an economy already strained by years of sanctions took another serious hit. And now, that same population is being told, through official state messaging, to prepare for the possibility that all of it could happen again. Imagine living under that kind of uncertainty, watching your government issue warnings about decisive responses while wondering whether your own city could become a target in the next round of strikes. That is the reality for millions of people right now, and it is easy to lose sight of that when we are just talking about geopolitics and military strategy. At the same time, it is worth remembering that this is a government that has, for decades, used external conflict and the perception of foreign aggression as a tool to unify domestic support and distract from internal economic struggles. That does not mean the threat from the United States and Israel is not real, because it absolutely is. Strikes have already happened. Military commanders have already been killed. This is not hypothetical tension. This is a conflict that has already produced real casualties and real destruction. But it does mean that when you are evaluating statements coming out of Tehran, it is worth asking who benefits from escalating the rhetoric right now, and often the answer involves internal political calculations, just as much as it involves genuine military strategy. So where does this leave us? Over the next few weeks, keep your eyes on a few specific things, because these are the signals that will tell you which direction this is actually heading. Watch what happens with the Strait of Hormuz negotiations specifically. If Iran actually follows through on reopening the strait completely, that is a genuine signal that the pragmatist faction inside the government is winning the internal argument. Watch for any further attacks on commercial shipping near Yemen, because those attacks, whether directly ordered by Iran or carried out by allied militias, are one of the clearest ways Tehran can apply pressure without technically starting a direct war. And watch what happens inside Iraq, because if Iranian-backed militias continue launching attacks despite the Iraqi government's efforts to rein them in, that could be the spark that pulls Saudi Arabia, Jordan, and other neighboring countries directly into this conflict, transforming a 2- or 3-way standoff into a genuine regional war. Let's take a step back for a moment and talk about the nuclear question, because this is the piece of the puzzle that ties everything else together, and honestly, it might be the single biggest reason this warning from Iran is being taken so seriously by governments around the world. For years, the international community has been locked in a standoff with Iran over its nuclear program. Iran has always insisted, publicly and repeatedly, that it has never pursued nuclear weapons and that its program exists purely for civilian energy purposes. The United States and its allies have never fully accepted that explanation. And after the strikes that hit Iranian nuclear facilities during the last major round of fighting, the entire calculus around this issue shifted dramatically. Now, any new deal being discussed between Washington and Tehran reportedly includes language about ending what American officials describe as Iran's nuclear threat entirely. That is an enormous demand, and it is one that touches the very core of how Iran's leadership views its own sovereignty and its own deterrence capability. Here is why that matters so much for understanding this latest warning. If you are Iran and you have just watched your nuclear facilities get struck, your military commanders get killed, and your air defenses get exposed as vulnerable, the temptation to hold on to whatever leverage you have left becomes incredibly strong. Missiles, proxy militias, and control over a critical global shipping route become the tools you lean on when your more advanced strategic options have been degraded. That is part of why the Strait of Hormuz has become such a central bargaining chip in these negotiations. It is one of the few pieces of leverage Iran still has that can genuinely make the rest of the world pay attention because, unlike a missile strike that might only affect the immediate region, a disruption to global oil shipping affects literally everyone, everywhere, almost overnight. Now, let's talk about something that rarely gets enough attention in coverage like this, and that is the psychological dimension of deterrence. When Iran issues a warning like this one, it is not just speaking to Washington and Tel Aviv. It is speaking to its own population, to its regional allies, and to countries watching from the sidelines like Russia and China. Domestically, the strong warning serves as a signal to the Iranian public that their government has not been broken by the last round of fighting, that it still has teeth, and that it is not simply capitulating to outside pressure. That matters enormously for a regime that relies heavily on projecting strength as a core part of its legitimacy. Regionally, the warning sends a message to allied militias in Yemen, Iraq, and Lebanon that Tehran is still willing to back them and still willing to escalate on their behalf if needed. And on the global stage, it sends a message to countries like Russia and China that Iran remains a relevant and unpredictable player in this part of the world, someone who cannot simply be written off or sidelined in future negotiations over energy and security in the region. There is also a historical pattern worth mentioning here, because this is not the first time we have seen this exact sequence play out. Iran has a long track record of oscillating between periods of aggressive rhetoric and periods of quiet diplomacy, often within the same week. You will see a senior military commander issue a fiery statement about decisive retaliation, and then just days later you will see a foreign ministry official quietly signal openness to further talks. This is not necessarily a sign of confusion or weakness inside the government. In many cases, it is a deliberate strategy, a way of keeping adversaries off balance while simultaneously testing how much room exists for a negotiated outcome. If you have followed Iranian foreign policy over the past decade, you have likely seen this pattern before, during previous nuclear negotiations, during tensions over regional proxy conflicts, and during past confrontations with the United States Navy in the Persian Gulf. What makes the current moment feel different is the scale of what just happened militarily in the months leading up to this warning. This is not posturing after a period of relative calm. This is posturing after actual combat, after real casualties, and after facilities on both sides sustaining real damage. Let's also talk about Israel's role in all of this, because so much of the coverage understandably focuses on the United States and Iran, but Israel has been an equally central player throughout this entire conflict. Israeli officials have consistently framed their military actions against Iran as necessary steps to prevent what they describe as an existential nuclear threat. From Israel's perspective, any pause in military pressure risks giving Iran the time and space to rebuild capabilities that could eventually be used against Israeli territory. That is precisely why reports of Iran using this ceasefire period to import equipment and reconstruct damaged systems are being viewed with such alarm inside Israeli defense circles. If you're sitting in Tel Aviv watching intelligence reports suggesting Iran is rearming during a supposed peace process, the pressure to strike again before that rearmament is complete becomes almost impossible to ignore. This creates an incredibly dangerous dynamic because it means every day that passes without a genuine, verifiable agreement increases the odds that either side decides waiting any longer is simply too risky. Now let's bring this back down to something a little more tangible, because all of this analysis means very little if we do not talk about what actual escalation would look like on the ground. If this ceasefire fully collapses and Iran follows through on the kind of decisive response its officials have been describing, the most likely flashpoints are not going to be limited to a single dramatic missile exchange. Instead, expect a multi-front response. That likely includes renewed missile and drone strikes on Israeli territory, increased attacks on shipping near Yemen carried out through Houthi forces backed by Iranian support, potential strikes or sabotage attempts targeting American military assets stationed across the Gulf region, and a serious risk of Iranian-backed militias in Iraq launching attacks against neighboring countries like Saudi Arabia and Jordan. Each of these fronts individually might seem containable, but taken together, they represent exactly the kind of sprawling, multi-directional crisis that becomes incredibly difficult for any single country, including the United States, to manage all at once. And that is really the core danger sitting underneath this entire situation. It is not just the possibility of a single strike or a single retaliation. It is the possibility that this conflict spreads outward, pulling in more countries, more proxy forces, and more fronts, until it becomes something far larger and far harder to control than what we saw in the initial round of fighting months ago. Once a conflict spreads across that many fronts simultaneously, de-escalation becomes exponentially harder because you are no longer just negotiating with one government. You are trying to manage the competing interests of Iran, the United States, Israel, Saudi Arabia, Iraq, Yemen's Houthi movement, and indirectly global powers like Russia and China, who each have their own stake in how this plays out. So, when you step back and look at the full picture, this latest warning from Iran is best understood not as an isolated event, but as a pressure gauge for an entire region that is currently sitting right at the edge of its tolerance. Every actor involved, from Tehran to Washington to Tel Aviv to Riyadh, is making calculations in real time about how much risk they are willing to accept, how much they trust the current diplomatic framework, and how much they believe the other side is genuinely committed to avoiding another war. Iran's warning is a snapshot of where those calculations currently stand inside Tehran, and right now that snapshot suggests a government that is preparing for the worst while still leaving the door open, even if just slightly, for something better. Here is the honest truth about where things stand right now. This is one of those moments in history where the outcome genuinely is not predetermined. There are real voices inside Iran pushing for a diplomatic resolution, and there are real voices pushing for confrontation. There are American officials threatening stronger action, and there are American officials who called off planned strikes the moment a diplomatic framework appeared possible. This warning that Iran just issued sits right in the middle of that uncertainty. It is both a threat and a message, both a show of strength and, if you read between the lines, an acknowledgement that Iran knows exactly how fragile this current moment really is. Whether this ends in a genuine, lasting agreement over the Strait of Hormuz and a real step back from the edge of another war, or whether it ends with a return to open conflict, is going to depend on factors that are still playing out behind closed doors in Tehran, in Washington, and across the entire region right now, today, as you are watching this. This is not a story that has already been written. It is unfolding in real time, and the decisions made in the next few weeks by a relatively small group of officials on all sides could shape the security and the economy of the entire world for years to come. If this breakdown helped you actually understand what is happening behind the headlines, instead of just seeing another scary-sounding title flash across your screen, that is exactly why this channel exists. To cut through the noise and give you the real picture. Make sure you are subscribed so you do not miss the next update, because this situation is moving fast, and what Iran does next and how the United States responds could be the difference between a fragile peace holding together or an entire region sliding back into war. Drop your thoughts down in the comments, because I genuinely want to know what you think happens next, and I will see you in the next one.